I'm Marcus Crawford, 47, and I'm worth $200 million through my tech empire that I built from nothing. 3 months ago, I went into emergency surgery for a heart condition routine, they said. While I was under anesthesia, fighting for my life, my parents did something unthinkable. They filed a fraudulent death certificate and attempted to claim my $50 million life insurance policy. When I woke up, legally, I was dead. My bank accounts were frozen, my assets were being transferred, and my own family was dividing up my fortune, like vultures over a corpse. They thought they'd gotten away with the perfect crime. They had no idea I was about to show them what a dead man with nothing left to lose could do. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who are supposed to love you most, hit that like button and subscribe because this story is just getting started. The story of how I built my fortune begins in a double-wide trailer in Riverside County, California. I was 7 years old when we moved there after my father lost his job at the steel plant. The trailer park was called Sunset Vista, though there was no vista and the only sunsets we saw were the dying dreams of everyone who lived there. My parents, Eleanor and Robert Crawford, were bitter people even then. Dad spent his days drinking Budweiser and cursing the system that had failed him. Mom worked double shifts at the diner, her hands perpetually smelling of grease and disappointment. They looked at their circumstances as something that happened to them, not something they could change, but I saw it differently. Even as a kid, I was fascinated by the computers at the public library. While other children played video games, I taught myself programming languages. By age 14, I was building websites for local businesses, charging $50 each. My parents thought it was cute little Marcus playing with his computer games. When I graduated high school at 16, I had already saved $8,000. I used every penny to move to San Francisco and enroll in community college while working at a tech startup. The startup failed within 6 months. But I learned more in those 6 months than most people learn in 4 years of college. At 22, I launched my first company, Dataflow Solutions, from a studio apartment that cost more per month than my parents made in 2. I lived on ramen noodles and determination. While my college friends were partying and dating, I was coding 18-hour days, building something that would change everything. The breakthrough came when I developed an algorithm that could predict consumer behavior with 93% accuracy suddenly. Every major corporation wanted to license my technology. Within 3 years, I had sold Dataflow for $47 million. But that was just the beginning. I took that money and built Crawford Technologies, focusing on artificial intelligence and machine learning. Each company I launched was bigger than the last. By 30, I was worth $50 million. By 40, it was $200 million and growing. Throughout this entire journey, my parents remained skeptical and dismissive. When I bought them a house, a real house with a yard and a 2-car garage, my father complained that it was too big and expensive to maintain. When I offered to pay for my brother David's college education, they suggested I should focus on finding a wife instead of showing off. With my money, the first stock certificate from Dataflow Solutions still hangs in my office, framed and mounted. Next to my degrees, it represents everything I built from nothing, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment I chose ambition over comfort. Looking at it now, knowing what my family tried to do, that certificate reminds me of a simple truth. Some people build empires, while others just wait for them to crumble so they can scavenge the ruins. Asterisk, the family photo sitting on my desk captures everything wrong with the Crawford family dynamic in a single frame. It was taken 3 Christmases ago at the house I bought for my parents in Pasadena. Everyone is smiling, but if you know what to look for, you can see the cracks beneath the surface. Eleanor Crawford, my mother, stands in the center wearing the designer dress I bought her for the occasion. At 68, she still carries herself with the rigid posture of someone who spent decades waiting tables, but there's something else in her expression, a calculating look that I missed at the time. Her smile doesn't reach her eyes, and her hand rests possessively on my brother David's shoulder, Robert Crawford. My father slouches beside her in the expensive suit that he complained about wearing. At 71, retirement hasn't been kind to him. Without the structure of work, his drinking increased, and his resentment toward successful people, especially his own son, grew more vocal. In the photo, his forced smile looks more like a grimace. David stands between them, 39 years old and still the golden child, despite a life filled with failures. While I was building companies, David was bouncing between jobs, relationships, and get-rich-quick schemes, but somehow in my parents' eyes, he remained the normal one, the son who didn't make them feel inadequate with his success. The photo was taken right after I announced I was buying them a vacation home in Palm Springs. Instead of gratitude, I remember the conversation that followed. My mother had pulled me aside and said, "Marcus, you know David's been struggling with his finances. Maybe instead of another house, you could help him get back on his feet." This was the pattern that had defined our family for decades. No matter how much I achieved or how generously I shared my success, it was never about celebrating accomplishments. It was always about what I could do for David. When I graduated summa cum laude from Stanford, the conversation at dinner was about David's need for a new car. When I sold my second company for $90 million, They asked if I could invest in David's latest business idea, food truck, that failed within 6 months. Looking at that photo now, I can see the signs I ignored for years. The way my parents always steered conversations toward money. How they remembered every detail about my business ventures but showed little interest in my personal life. The subtle hints about estate planning and what happens if something happens to you. I kept that photo on my desk as a reminder of family, but now I see it differently. It's evidence of a performance, 3 people pretending to love the 4th, while plotting how to profit from his success. The smiles are masks, the affection is calculated, and the son they're embracing is nothing more than a walking inheritance to them. David Crawford was born 2 years after me, but you'd think he was the firstborn son the way our parents treated him. While I was the responsible one, David was the charming one. While I was building my future, David was living in the moment. And while I was succeeding, David was failing spectacularly at, somehow always remaining the favorite. The stack of gambling debts I discovered in my investigation tells the real story of my brother's life. IOUs, 2 bookies, cash advance receipts, credit cards maxed out at casino ATMs. The numbers are staggering. Over $300,000 in gambling debts accumulated over the past 5 years. But this was just the latest chapter in a lifetime of financial disasters. David's pattern started early. In high school, he was caught selling stolen electronics. In college, which I paid for, he was expelled for running an illegal poker game in his dorm. After graduation, he burned through a series of job sales positions where he spent more money than he made. Management roles where he embezzled to cover his gambling losses. Entrepreneurial ventures that existed only to launder money he'd borrowed from increasingly dangerous people. Each time David fell, our parents expected me to catch him. When he lost his job at the car dealership, I was supposed to loan him money. When his wife left him and took half of everything, I was supposed to help with the divorce lawyer. When the bookies started making threats, I was supposed to pay them off. And I did, every single time, because that's what family does. What I didn't realize was how much my parents resented having to ask me for help. Every time they called to request another bailout for David, I could hear the humiliation in their voices. They wanted to be the ones with power, the ones dispensing aid, rather than begging for it. My success had inverted the natural family hierarchy, and they never forgave me for it. The breaking point came last year when David's gambling debts reached a new low. He'd borrowed money from a loan shark to bet on a sure thing at the track. The sure thing came in 4th. The loan shark wanted $50,000 immediately, plus interest. David came to me, tears in his eyes, swearing this was the last time. But instead of coming alone, he brought our parents. They sat in my office, the same office where I'd built an empire, lectured me about family loyalty. My mother actually said, "We know you can afford it, Marcus. What's $50,000 to someone like you, someone like me?" As if my money had materialized from thin air. As if I hadn't earned every dollar through sacrifice and hard work while David was throwing his life away one bet at a time. I paid the debt, but I also made a decision. I hired a private investigator to monitor David's activities. I wanted to know exactly where my money was going, and whether my brother was actually getting the help he claimed to need. The PI's reports painted a picture of a man spiraling deeper into addiction, enabled by parents who saw his brother as an endless ATM. The most damning evidence was a recording of David talking to a bookie about his brother's deep pockets. He actually said, "Don't worry about the money. My brother's got millions. He'll pay." That's when I realized I wasn't helping David. I was funding his destruction while my parents cheered from the sidelines. The $50 million life insurance policy seemed like a smart financial decision at the time. My wealth was tied up in companies and investments, and I wanted to ensure that my charitable foundation would be fully funded if something happened to me. My financial advisor, Jennifer Chen, walked me through the options and recommended a term policy with a reputable company. What I didn't anticipate was how the existence of that policy would change my family's behavior toward me. The first sign something was wrong came during a family dinner 6 months after I'd taken out the policy. I'd casually mentioned it while discussing estate planning, something responsible wealthy people do. I explained how the money would go toward the Marcus Crawford Foundation for Educational Technology, ensuring that underprivileged kids would have access to computer programming courses. The silence that followed was deafening. My father set down his fork and stared at me. $50 million, he repeated, and it's all going to strangers. My mother's reaction was even more telling. She actually laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "Marcus, honey, don't you think family should come first? We've supported you your whole life." David just nodded along, but I caught him doing calculations on his phone under the table. After that dinner, the phone calls started. Not the usual requests for David's latest bailout, but subtle inquiries about my health, my stress levels, my lifestyle choices. My mother began sending me articles about heart disease and successful businessmen. My father started telling stories about men our age who'd worked themselves to death. David suddenly became interested in my exercise routine and whether I was taking care of myself. The most disturbing conversation happened during what was supposed to be a casual lunch with my mother. She brought up a friend whose son had died unexpectedly. leaving behind a large insurance policy that had saved the family financially. She went into uncomfortable detail about how the insurance money had allowed them to pay off debts, buy a new house, and secure their retirement. Then she looked directly at me and said, "It's funny how death can sometimes be a blessing in disguise." Jennifer Chen, my financial advisor, noticed the changes to what she called me after my parents had contacted her office multiple times, asking questions about the policies, terms, and conditions. They wanted to know about the payout timeline, the claims process, and whether there were any circumstances that might void the coverage. "Marcus," Jennifer said during our quarterly review, "I have two asks. Did you give your parents details about your life insurance policy?" When I confirmed that I had, her expression grew serious. "I need to be blunt with you. In my 20 years of experience, I've seen families become opportunistic when they know about large policies. The questions your parents are asking aren't normal curious family member questions. They're the kinds of questions someone asks when they're planning." She recommended I limit their access to information about my finances and consider changing my emergency contacts. At the time, I thought she was being paranoid. These were my parents, after all. They'd raised me, supported my dreams when I was young, and celebrated my successes. But the seed of doubt was planted, and it grew stronger with each subsequent interaction. My parents started asking about my schedule, my travel plans, my medical appointments. They wanted to know when I'd be alone, when I'd be vulnerable, when I'd be out of contact. The final warning sign came from David's ex-wife Carmen, who called me out of the blue. We'd remained friendly after her divorce from my brother, and she'd always been direct with me about David's problems. "Marcus," she said, "I don't know how to tell you this, but David's been talking about your insurance policy. He's been asking me if I think you've updated your will lately, and whether I know who your beneficiaries are. It's creepy, and I thought you should know." That conversation happened 3 weeks before my surgery, 3 weeks before my parents would try to collect on a policy by declaring me dead while I fought for my life on an operating table. Looking back, the signs were all there. The sudden interest in my health, the morbid conversations about death and insurance, the calculating looks when they thought I wasn't watching. My family hadn't just learned about my policy, they'd begun to see it as their retirement plan, with my death as the only obstacle to their financial security. Asterisk. The chest pains started during a board meeting on a Tuesday morning in March. At first, I thought it was stress. We were in the middle of negotiating a $200 million acquisition, and the other party was playing hardball. But when the pain radiated down my left arm and my vision started to blur, I knew this was something more serious. My assistant, Sarah, called 911 while I tried to convince myself this was just a panic attack. The paramedics arrived within minutes and rushed me to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The emergency room doctor, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Rodriguez, ran a series of tests and delivered the diagnosis with clinical precision. I had a blocked coronary artery that required immediate surgical intervention. "We're looking at emergency bypass surgery," she explained. "The blockage is severe, and waiting isn't an option. We need to operate within the next few hours." The medical records from that day paint a picture of controlled chaos. My heart function was deteriorating rapidly, and the surgical team had to move quickly to prevent a massive heart attack. Dr. Martinez, the cardiovascular surgeon, explained that the procedure would take 4 to 6 hours, depending on what they found once they opened me up. As they prepped me for surgery, I made the calls I thought were necessary. I contacted my lawyer to ensure my affairs were in order, called my assistant to cancel meetings for the next week, and reluctantly called my parents to let them know what was happening. My mother's reaction was immediate and intense. "Oh my God, Marcus, we're coming right now. Don't you dare go into that surgery without us there." There was something in her voice, not just concern, but almost excitement. At the time, I attributed it to panic. My father was more subdued, but insisted they needed to be at the hospital. "Son, you can't go through this alone. Family needs to stick together." David, predictably, was on his way but would need to handle a few things first. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Kim, went over the risks one final time. While the surgery had a high success rate, there were always complications that could arise. Bleeding, infection, reaction to anesthesia, the standard warnings that every surgical patient hears. What he didn't warn me about was that my own family would try to profit from those risks. My parents arrived just as they were wheeling me into the pre-op area. My mother was crying, or at least making crying sounds. My father stood rigid beside her, asking detailed questions about the surgery timeline, recovery expectations, and what would happen if complications arose. "How long will he be unconscious?" my father asked Dr. Martinez. "What are the chances he won't make it through?" my mother added, which seemed like an odd question for a concerned parent to ask so directly. Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable but answered professionally, "The surgery has a 95% success rate. Barring any unforeseen complications, Marcus should make a full recovery." I remember my parents exchanging a look that I couldn't interpret at the time. Now I know it was disappointment as they administered the anesthesia. My last conscious memory was my mother squeezing my hand and whispering, "Don't worry, honey. We'll take care of everything while you're sleeping." Her grip felt cold, almost possessive. What I learned later was that my parents didn't spend those 6 hours in the waiting room praying for my recovery. Instead, they spent them implementing a plan they'd apparently been developing since learning about my insurance policy. While I was fighting for my life on the operating table, they were 20 miles away at the Los Angeles County Clerk's office, filing fraudulent paperwork that would legally declare me dead. The medical records show that the surgery was actually a complete success. Dr. Martinez was able to clear the blockage and restore full blood flow to my heart. My vital signs remained stable throughout the procedure, and I was moved to the cardiac ICU in excellent condition. But according to the death certificate my parents filed that same day, Marcus Crawford had died at 3:47 p.m. due to complications from cardiac surgery. The timestamp on that death certificate is particularly chilling. It was filed while I was still in surgery, before the doctors even knew the outcome. My parents weren't waiting to see if I would survive. They were betting that I wouldn't, and when it became clear that I would pull through, they decided to kill me legally anyway. When I woke up 12 hours later, groggy but alive, I had no idea that in the eyes of the law, I was already dead and buried. ***, the forged death certificate is a masterpiece of criminal planning, and I've studied every detail of how they created it. The document that would legally erase me from existence was crafted with a level of premeditation that still takes my breath away. My parents arrived at the hospital at 11:30 a.m., exactly 30 minutes after I was wheeled into surgery, but they didn't come alone. Security footage shows them meeting with a man named Ernest Valdez in the hospital parking garage. A man I later discovered was a clerk in the Los Angeles County Registrar's office who had been taking bribes for falsified documents for over a decade. Valdez had come prepared. He carried a briefcase containing blank death certificate forms, an official county seal, and the stamps necessary to make the document appear legitimate. What he needed from my parents were the specific details that would make the forgery believable. My full legal name, social security number, exact birth date, and current address information only family members would readily know. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While I was in surgery, they would create a death certificate stating that I had died from complications during the procedure. They would backdate it to make it appear as though the hospital had filed it immediately after my supposed death. Valdez would then enter the certificate into the county's system, making my death legally official. The timing was crucial. They needed to file the certificate while I was still unconscious and unable to contradict it. They also needed to begin the insurance claim process immediately. Life insurance companies are required to investigate any claims filed within the first year of a policy, but they're less likely to scrutinize claims that come with official death certificates from reputable sources. At 1:15 p.m., while Dr. Martinez was successfully clearing the blockage in my coronary artery, my parents were in Valdez's car in the hospital parking lot, watching him fill out the death certificate. My mother provided my personal information while my father dictated the cause of death: cardiac arrest due to complications from coronary artery bypass surgery. The official time of death was listed as 3:47 p.m., more than 2 hours in the future. They were so confident in their plan that they didn't even wait to see if I would actually die during surgery. In their minds, I was already dead. The paperwork was just a formality. Valdez filed the certificate electronically at 2:23 p.m., while I was still on the operating table. Within minutes, the Los Angeles County records system showed Marcus Crawford as deceased. The death certificate was automatically forwarded to the Social Security Administration, the IRS, and various other government agencies that track such matters. While this was happening, David was implementing his part of the plan. He was at my office, supposedly handling business affairs during my surgery, but actually copying financial documents and accessing my computer systems. Security footage shows him printing bank statements, insurance policies, and investment portfolios. He was preparing for the asset grab that would follow my legal death. The most chilling part of their plan was how they handled the hospital staff. When Dr. Martinez completed the surgery successfully and called the waiting room to inform my family of the good news, there was no one there to receive it. My parents had left the hospital immediately after filing the death certificate. When they returned 3 hours later, they performed an Oscar-worthy display of grief and shock. My mother collapsed dramatically when Dr. Martinez told them I was stable and recovering well. "Thank God," she sobbed. "We were so worried. We went to the chapel to pray, and we were so afraid you were going to tell us he didn't make it." But their performance had a flaw. Dr. Martinez later told investigators that my mother's first question after being told I was stable wasn't about my condition or when she could see me. Instead, she asked about the hospital's process for notifying authorities when a patient dies during surgery. When Dr. Martinez looked confused and assured her that I was very much alive, she quickly covered by saying she was just curious because she'd heard horror stories about families not being properly notified. My father's questions were even more suspicious. He asked detailed questions about the exact time the surgery had ended, whether there had been any moments when my vital signs had flatlined, and how the hospital documented any complications during procedures. These weren't the questions of a relieved father, they were the questions of a man trying to determine whether his death certificate would be believable. The final piece of their plan was the insurance claim. David had been tasked with contacting the insurance company within 24 hours of my death to begin the claims process. The faster they filed, the more legitimate it would appear. They were counting on the insurance company accepting the official death certificate without question, especially since it came from a reputable hospital and was properly filed with county authorities. What they didn't count on was me waking up. I woke up in the cardiac ICU at 6:30 a.m. 18 hours after my surgery began. The first thing I noticed was the steady beeping of the heart monitor, a sound that confirmed I was very much alive. The second thing I noticed was that my parents weren't there. Dr. Martinez stopped by during his morning rounds and seemed genuinely pleased with my recovery. "You're doing exceptionally well, Marcus. The surgery was a complete success. We'll keep you in the ICU for another day or two, but you should be going home by the end of the week." I asked about my parents, and Dr. Martinez's expression shifted slightly. "They were here yesterday evening, but they seemed unusually distressed. Your mother became quite emotional when I explained that you were stable. I assured them you were going to make a full recovery, but they left rather abruptly." Something about his tone suggested there was more to the story, but I was still groggy from the anesthesia and didn't press for details. I assumed they were just overwhelmed by the stress of the situation. My first indication that something was seriously wrong came when I tried to call my assistant, Sarah, to let her know I was okay. My phone was dead, so I asked a nurse if I could use the hospital phone to make a business call. She agreed, but when I tried to call my office, the receptionist's response was strange. "I'm sorry, but I can't transfer you to Sarah's extension," she said. "She's dealing with some family matters right now." I identified myself and asked to speak with Sarah directly. There was a long pause before the receptionist said, "Sir, I'm going to need to transfer you to HR. Please hold." The HR director, Janet Morrison, came on the line with a tone I'd never heard from her before, cautious, almost frightened. "Marcus, where are you calling from?" "I'm at Sinai. I had surgery yesterday, but I'm fine. I just wanted to check in." "And Marcus," she interrupted, "we need to talk. But not over the phone. Can you have someone come to your office? Someone you trust." The urgency in her voice alarmed me. "Janet, what's going on? Is there a problem with the acquisition?" "The acquisition is the least of our problems right now. Marcus, I received a call this morning from your brother David. He said you died during surgery yesterday. He had a death certificate." The words hit me like a physical blow. "He had a what?" "A death certificate. From Los Angeles County. It shows you died yesterday at 3:47 p.m. from surgical complications." "Marcus, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. The entire office is in mourning. I've already started the process of freezing company assets pending a state resolution." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she was telling me. "Janet, I'm obviously not dead. I'm talking to you right now. I know that, but legally, according to this document, you are. Marcus, you need to get a lawyer involved immediately. Someone has filed fraudulent paperwork, and it's going to take time to unravel this mess." After hanging up, I tried to access my bank account using the hospital's patient portal. The result was a form letter that made my blood run cold. "We regret to inform you that this account has been frozen due to the death of the primary account holder. Please contact our estate services department to discuss the claims process." I tried 3 more banks with the same result. Every single one of my accounts had been frozen based on the fraudulent death certificate. Credit cards, investment accounts, even my corporate credit lines, everything was locked down. The nurse who had been monitoring my vitals noticed my distress. "Mr. Crawford, your heart rate is elevated. Are you experiencing any chest pain?" "I'm experiencing something worse than chest pain," I told her. "I'm experiencing the realization that my family tried to murder me financially while I was unconscious." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and growing horror. My lawyer, Michael Torres, rushed to the hospital after I called him from the nurse's station. He brought copies of the documents David had presented to various institutions, and seeing my own death certificate was surreal and terrifying. "Marcus, this is sophisticated fraud," Michael said, studying the document. "This isn't just a forged paper, it's been entered into the official county records system. Whoever did this had inside help." The bank rejection letter I received later that day was the final confirmation of how thoroughly my family had betrayed me. It was addressed to the estate of Marcus Crawford, and explained that all assets had been frozen pending proper probate proceedings. The letter suggested that family members contact the estate services department to begin the claims process. I realized that while I was fighting for my life in surgery, my parents had been implementing a plan to steal everything I'd worked for. They hadn't just wished for my death, they had legally created it, betting that either I would actually die during surgery, or that by the time I recovered, the financial damage would be irreversible. But they had made one critical error in their planning. They assumed I would be helpless, confused, and overwhelmed by the bureaucratic nightmare they'd created. They didn't account for the fact that a man who built a $200 million empire from nothing might have the resources and determination to fight back. As I lay in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines that proved I was alive while legal documents declared me dead, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be a victim of my family's greed. I was going to methodically destroy them the same way they had tried to destroy me. From my hospital bed, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of immediately trying to prove I was alive through official process that could take months and alert my family to my knowledge of their scheme, I would gather evidence of their conspiracy first. I needed to understand exactly what they had done and who had helped them before I revealed that their plan had failed. I called Rebecca Martinez, a private investigator I'd used for corporate due diligence. Rebecca was former FBI, and she specialized in financial crimes and fraud investigations. She had the skills and connections to uncover the truth without tipping off the conspirators. "Rebecca, I need you to investigate my own death," I said when she arrived at the hospital later that day. She looked at me lying in the hospital bed, very obviously alive, and raised an eyebrow. "That's either the darkest joke I've ever heard, or the most interesting case I've ever taken." I handed her copies of the death certificate and bank documents. "It's not a joke. Someone filed this while I was in surgery yesterday. I need to know who, how, and why before I make my next move." Rebecca studied the documents with professional interest. "This is sophisticated work. The certificate isn't just forged, it's been properly entered into the system. That means someone with legitimate access to county record systems was involved." Within 48 hours, Rebecca's preliminary report painted a picture of conspiracy that was both broader and more personal than I had imagined. The investigation revealed that my family's plan had been in development for at least 3 months, with multiple participants and backup strategies. The key conspirator was Ernest Valdez, a 15-year veteran of the Los Angeles County Registrar's office who had been supplementing his income by selling fraudulent documents. Rebecca's contacts in law enforcement revealed that Valdez was already under investigation for similar crimes, but my case was by far the most ambitious fraud he had attempted. The financial trail showed that my parents had paid Valdez $15,000 for his services, money that came from David's most recent emergency loan from me. They had literally used my own money to pay for my legal assassination. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing. This wasn't their first attempt. Rebecca discovered that my parents had been researching the process of filing death certificates for over 6 months. They had visited the county clerk's office multiple times, ostensibly to obtain copies of death certificates for elderly relatives, but actually to study the process and identify potential inside sources. The private investigator's report also revealed the extent of David's involvement. He wasn't just a passive beneficiary of the scheme, he was the operational coordinator. Cell phone records showed extensive communication between David and Valdez in the weeks leading up to my surgery. David had been the one to identify and approach Valdez, using his gambling connections to find someone willing to commit fraud for money. The most damning evidence came from surveillance footage at the hospital. Rebecca had obtained security camera footage from the day of my surgery, and it showed the precise timeline of my parents' activities. They had arrived at the hospital, met with Valdez in the parking garage, left the hospital during my surgery, returned after filing the death certificate, and then performed their grief-stricken family act for the medical staff. The footage also revealed something I hadn't expected. They had brought flowers and a sympathy card with them when they returned to the hospital. They had purchased condolence flowers for my death before knowing whether I would survive the surgery. The receipt showed they had bought the flowers at 10:30 a.m., 30 minutes before my surgery even began. Rebecca's investigation extended beyond the immediate conspiracy. She discovered that my parents had already contacted my insurance company to inquire about the claims process. David had called the very day after my surgery, claiming to be my designated representative, and asked detailed questions about documentation requirements for death benefit claims. The insurance company had properly requested official documentation before processing any claim, but David had assured them that he would have the death certificate and other necessary paperwork within days. He had even asked about the possibility of expedited processing, claiming the family needed the money quickly to pay for funeral expenses. Most disturbing of all, Rebecca's investigation revealed that my parents had been in contact with the estate planning attorney who specialized in rapid probate processing for families who needed quick access to assets. They had scheduled a meeting for the week after my surgery to discuss efficiently distributing the deceased's estate among family members. The private investigator's report concluded with a recommendation that chilled me. "Mr. Crawford, this was not a crime of opportunity. This was a premeditated conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and potentially murder. The level of planning and coordination suggests that if you had actually died during surgery, your family would have been prepared to claim your entire estate within weeks. The fact that you survived has disrupted their timeline, but they are likely to attempt to salvage their plan. You should consider yourself in immediate danger." As I read Rebecca's report, I realized that my parents hadn't just tried to steal My money they had been actively hoping for my death. The flowers, the sympathy card, the pre-planned meetings with attorneys and insurance companies. They had been preparing to mourn me while counting my money. The investigation gave me something more valuable than evidence. It gave me a complete understanding of my enemy. My family had revealed themselves to be calculating, greedy, and utterly without conscience. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Now it was time to show them what a dead man with nothing left to lose could accomplish. Years of building companies had taught me one crucial lesson: never put all your assets in one basket, and always have contingency plans. What my family didn't know, what no one knew except my most trusted financial advisors, was that I had been moving money offshore for the past 5 years. Not to avoid taxes, but to protect myself from exactly this kind of situation. The offshore account statements that my lawyer retrieved from a Swiss safety deposit box showed balances that would have shocked my parents. While they were celebrating their successful theft of my entire fortune, they had actually only managed to freeze about 60% of my wealth. The remaining 40%, nearly $80 million, was safely tucked away in accounts they couldn't touch, couldn't trace, and couldn't even imagine existed. The decision to create these hidden accounts had been made after a conversation with another tech entrepreneur whose ex-wife had tried to claim half of his company during their divorce. He'd told me something that stuck with me. Marcus, money is like water. If you only keep it in one container, someone can tip that container over and spill everything. Smart people keep their water in multiple containers, and they hide some of those containers where no one else can find them. I had taken that advice to heart. Through a series of perfectly legal offshore structures, trusts registered in the Cayman Islands, holding companies in Singapore, and investment accounts in Switzerland, I had created a financial safety net that existed completely outside the reach of American courts and government agencies. The beauty of these arrangements was their invisibility. The accounts weren't secret or illegal. They were simply structured in ways that made them difficult to discover without specific knowledge of their existence. My domestic financial statements showed the bulk of my wealth, but they didn't reveal the offshore structures that held my insurance policy against disaster. From my hospital bed, I began accessing these hidden accounts using encrypted connections and authentication methods that would have impressed cybersecurity experts. Within hours, I had liquid access to funds that dwarfed what most people earn in a lifetime. More importantly, I had resources that my family couldn't freeze, couldn't steal, and couldn't even detect. The Swiss account alone contained $35 million in cash and short-term investments. The Cayman Islands Trust held another $20 million in blue-chip stocks and bonds. The Singapore holding company controlled another $25 million in various international investments. My parents thought they had killed the golden goose, but they had only managed to clip its wings temporarily. With access to these funds, I could do something my family never expected. I could operate in complete secrecy while they believed they had neutralized me. They thought I was helpless, trapped in bureaucratic red tape while they divided up my estate. Instead, I had more operational capital than most small countries. My first move was to hire the best legal team money could buy, to immediately challenge the death certificate, but to begin building a comprehensive case against everyone involved in the conspiracy. I retained Thompson, Morrison & Associates, a white-collar criminal defense firm that normally represented Fortune 500 companies in federal investigations. The lead attorney, Patricia Thompson, was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in complex fraud cases. When I explained the situation during our first meeting, she immediately understood both the legal complexities and the strategic opportunities. Marcus, what your family has done isn't just fraud, it's potentially racketeering under federal RICO statutes, she explained. They've engaged in a pattern of criminal activity involving multiple parties across state lines. If we handle this correctly, we can ensure they spend the next decade in federal prison. But Patricia also warned me about the risks of premature action. If we move too quickly to prove you're alive, we lose the element of surprise. Right now, they think they've won. They're relaxed, confident, and likely to make mistakes. The longer we can maintain the illusion that their plan worked, the more evidence they'll create against themselves. This strategic patience would require me to remain legally dead while building my case. It meant watching my family celebrate my demise while I planned their destruction. It meant letting them file insurance claims, meet with estate attorneys, and begin dividing up assets that weren't actually available to them. From the outside, it would appear that Marcus Crawford had died during surgery and his family was grieving while handling his affairs. But from the inside, Marcus Crawford was very much alive, financially empowered, and systematically documenting every aspect of their criminal conspiracy. The offshore accounts gave me something more valuable than money. They gave me independence from the system my family had tried to manipulate. While they played games with death certificates and domestic bank accounts, I was operating on an entirely different level, with resources they couldn't imagine and capabilities they couldn't comprehend. My parents had made a fundamental error in their planning. They had assumed that wealth made me soft, that success had made me vulnerable, that family ties would prevent me from fighting back effectively. They were about to learn that the same ruthless intelligence that built a business empire could be turned toward destruction just as effectively. The hidden accounts weren't just my financial lifeline, they were my war chest. And I was about to show my family what happens when you declare war on someone who fights back with unlimited resources and nothing left to lose. Asterisk. The recording device that would ultimately destroy my family was smaller than a matchbox and more sophisticated than anything the FBI used a decade ago. Rebecca Martinez had acquired it through her law enforcement contacts, a piece of equipment originally designed for undercover operations that could record conversations from over feet away with crystal clear audio quality. Installing surveillance in my parents' house required careful planning. I needed access to their home without arousing suspicion, and I needed to place devices where they would capture conversations, but remain undetected for weeks or even months. The opportunity came when my mother called the hospital ostensibly to check on my condition, but actually to gather intelligence about my recovery timeline. She spoke to my nurse and asked detailed questions about when I might be discharged, whether I would need home care, and if I would be able to live independently immediately after release. "We're so worried about Marcus being alone during his recovery," she told the nurse. "We'd like to prepare his house for when he comes home. Maybe we could go over there and make sure everything is ready for him." The nurse, trying to be helpful, suggested that family members often prepared recovery spaces for patients returning from cardiac surgery. My mother immediately seized on this, saying they had a spare key and would make sure everything was perfect. For my homecoming, what they were actually doing was planning to search my house for additional financial documents, safe combinations, and anything else that might help them access assets they hadn't already frozen. But their greed gave me the perfect opportunity to turn their own house into a recording studio while they were burglarizing my home. I was having Rebecca's technical team install surveillance equipment throughout theirs. Cameras in the living room and kitchen, audio recording devices in the master bedroom and David's old room where he was staying, and a particularly sophisticated system in my father's home office, where they were coordinating their criminal activities. The first recordings were revelatory. That very evening, as my parents returned from rifling through my house, they celebrated their successful day like criminals dividing up the spoils of a heist. "Did you find anything useful?" my father asked as they settled into their living room. "Uh-oh, Robert, it was better than I hoped," my mother replied, her voice filled with excitement. He had bank statements just sitting on his desk. The man had no idea how to keep his finances private. "I found account numbers, investment portfolios, even passwords written down in a notebook." "What about the safe?" David's voice joined the conversation. "We couldn't get into it, but honestly, how much more money could he possibly have hidden away? We've already got access to everything that matters." The recording captured my father laughing as he said, "I have to admit, I'm almost proud of how well this worked out. When that heart attack happened, it was like the universe was telling us it was time to collect on our investment in that ungrateful son." "Investment?" my mother scoffed. "Robert, we raised him, fed him, put a roof over his head for 18 years. Everything he earned should have been ours anyway. We're not stealing from him, we're collecting what he owed us." These recordings revealed the depth of their self-justification. In their minds, they weren't committing fraud, they were claiming what was rightfully theirs. My success wasn't the result of my own work and intelligence. It was somehow their property because they had provided basic parental care decades earlier. But the most damning recordings came from conversations between David and his bookie contacts. David, flush with anticipated wealth, had been bragging about the family's windfall and placing bets on credit against his expected inheritance. "Trust me, Sal," David said in one particularly clear recording, "the money's coming. My brother died, and we're looking at millions from insurance and his estate. I can cover any losses until the paperwork clears." "Your brother died." Sal's voice was skeptical. "Didn't you just ask me for a loan to pay him back last month?" "Yeah, well that's the beauty of it. The timing worked out perfectly. He had this heart surgery and complications during the procedure. Let's just say the family won't be worrying about money anymore." The recording captured Sal's uncomfortable silence before he said, "David, that sounds fucked up. Are you telling me your brother actually died? Or are you running some kind of scam?" "Does it matter?" David replied. "Dead is dead, and money is money. The important thing is that I can cover my bets now." These recordings weren't just evidence of fraud, they were evidence of complete moral bankruptcy. My family wasn't just stealing my money, they were celebrating my supposed death while using anticipated funeral money to fund gambling addictions. But the surveillance system also captured their meetings with various accomplices. Ernest Valdez visited the house twice, both times to collect additional payments for handling complications with the death certificate. During one visit, I heard Valdez warn my parents that falsifying death certificates was a federal crime with serious consequences. "Look, I've done this before, but never for someone this wealthy or high profile," Valdez said. "If this goes wrong, we're all looking at prison time. I need another 10,000 to make sure certain records disappear and certain people keep quiet." My father's response was immediate, "Whatever it costs. We've come this far. and there's no going back now. Just make sure it's airtight. The recording equipment captured everything. Their conspiracy meetings, their division of anticipated assets, their casual discussions about my supposed death, and their planning for what they would do with their stolen wealth. Every word was clear, every voice was identifiable, and every conversation was automatically backed up to secure servers that would be admissible in federal court. Within 2 weeks, I had dozens of hours of recorded conversations that documented the entire criminal enterprise. My family had unknowingly provided a complete confession of their crimes, recorded in their own voices, in the comfort of their own home. But the recordings revealed something else that changed my strategy entirely. My parents weren't just planning to steal my current assets, they were planning to steal my company. They had been meeting with corporate attorneys to discuss their rights as my heirs, to claim ownership of Crawford Technologies. The company is worth more than everything else combined, my mother said during one recorded conversation. If we can get control of that, we'll never have to worry about money again. That's when I realized this wasn't just about insurance fraud or frozen bank accounts. My family was attempting a complete corporate takeover, using my legal death as the justification to seize control of everything I had built. They had declared war on my entire life's work. It was time to show them what total war actually looked like. The conspiracy chart that Rebecca Martinez created looked like something from an organized crime investigation. Connecting lines, photographs, financial transactions, and communication records mapped out a criminal network that extended far beyond my immediate family. What had started as a simple insurance fraud had revealed a web of corruption that reached into multiple government agencies and professional services. At the center of the chart was Ernest Valdez, but he wasn't the mastermind I had initially believed him to be. Deeper investigation revealed that Valdez was part of a larger document fraud operation that had been running for years. The Los Angeles County Registrar's Office had been compromised by a network of corrupt employees who specialized in creating false identities, fake death certificates, and fraudulent property transfers. Rebecca's investigation uncovered at least 12 other cases where Valdez and his associates had filed false death certificates over the past 3 years. The victims were typically elderly individuals with substantial assets, but no close family oversight. In most cases, distant relatives or caregivers would pay the fraud network to declare someone dead, claim their assets, and disappear before the crime was discovered. My case was different only in scale and the victim's inconvenient survival. The financial trail revealed how the network operated. Payments to Valdez were funneled through a series of shell companies that also handled money laundering for other criminal enterprises. The $15,000 my parents had paid was just the down payment. Additional fees were collected for ongoing services, like suppressing investigations and maintaining false records. But the most shocking discovery was the identity of the network's protection. Detective Raymond Morrison, of the LAPD's Financial Crimes Division. Morrison had been receiving monthly payments to ensure that death certificate fraud cases were either ignored or investigated so poorly that prosecutions failed. Rebecca's surveillance of Morrison revealed the scope of his corruption. He had access to police databases that allowed him to identify when fraud investigations were beginning, and he would warn the network in advance. He also had the authority to delay or misdirect investigations, ensuring that evidence disappeared and witnesses became unavailable. The conspiracy chart showed Morrison's connections to at least 15 cases of financial fraud involving fake deaths, including 2 cases where the deceased individuals had actually been murdered after the certificates were filed. Morrison hadn't just been protecting document fraud, he had been enabling a criminal organization that included actual killers. David's role in the network was more extensive than I had imagined. Through his gambling connections, he had been introduced to the fraud network 2 years earlier when he needed fake documents to escape debts to dangerous creditors. He had used their services to create a false identity that allowed him to open new credit accounts and continue gambling without consequences. When the opportunity arose to eliminate his brother's inconvenient survival, David had recommended the network to our parents. But his relationship with these criminals had evolved beyond simple transactions. The recordings revealed that David had become a full participant in the network, helping to identify potential victims and coordinating family access to their assets. David's brought us 3 good targets this year, Valdez said during one recorded conversation. Rich families with internal problems, people who won't be missed right away. He's got a good eye for the right kind of victim. The insurance investigator on the network's payroll was Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of the industry who had been supplementing her income by fast-tracking fraudulent claims. Santos had access to insurance company databases and internal investigation procedures, allowing the network to craft claims that would pass initial scrutiny and be approved quickly. Rebecca's investigation revealed that Santos had approved over 30 fraudulent death benefit claims in the past 5 years, totaling more than $20 million in stolen insurance payouts. She had developed sophisticated methods for making fraudulent claims appear legitimate, including creating fake medical records and bribing hospital administrators to provide supporting documentation. The most disturbing aspect of the network was its reach into county government. Beyond Valdez, at least 4 other county employees were involved in the conspiracy. They had access to property records, probate court filings, and estate processing systems. This allowed them to manipulate not just death certificates, but entire estate transfers. The chart showed how a typical operation worked. Corrupt county employees would identify wealthy individuals with complicated family situations. Criminal associates would arrange for their deaths, either natural or assisted. False death certificates would be filed, and connected insurance investigators would fast-track benefit claims. The money would be laundered through shell companies before being distributed. Among network participants, my parents had stumbled into this network through David's gambling debts, but they had quickly become active participants. The recordings showed them discussing other potential victims' wealthy neighbors, business associates, even distant relatives who might be targeted for similar schemes. "Once we finish with Marcus, there's that widow down the street," my mother said during one recorded conversation. "She's got no children, lots of money, and she's been having health problems. Might be worth exploring." The investigation revealed that my family hadn't just tried to steal my money, they had joined a criminal organization that had been systematically murdering wealthy people for years. I wasn't just their victim, I was their entry point into a much larger and more dangerous criminal enterprise. Rebecca's final report included a recommendation that chilled me. "Mr. Crawford, this network has killed people who interfered with their operations. Your survival has created a significant problem for them, and they're likely to attempt a permanent solution. You should consider yourself in immediate physical danger." But the report also provided an opportunity. With complete documentation of the network's operations, we had evidence of dozens of felonies involving multiple federal agencies. The FBI would be very interested in a case that included murder, insurance fraud, money laundering, and government corruption. More importantly, the network's extensive criminal history meant that my parents' case wouldn't be treated as a simple family dispute over money. They had joined a criminal organization with a body count, and they would be prosecuted as the dangerous felons they had become. The conspiracy chart had revealed the true scope of what I was fighting. This wasn't just about my parents' greed, it was about dismantling a criminal network that had been destroying lives for years. My resurrection wouldn't just save my own life, it would expose a conspiracy that had killed innocent people and corrupted multiple government institutions. My family had thought they were clever enough to steal from a tech millionaire. Instead, they had led law enforcement directly to one of the most sophisticated criminal networks in California history. The funeral program for Marcus Crawford was printed on expensive cream-colored paper with gold lettering, the kind of elegant memorial service befitting a successful businessman who had died tragically young. The program included a photograph of me from a business magazine interview, a timeline of my accomplishments, and heartfelt tributes from family members who had spent weeks planning my financial murder. I attended my own funeral. Rebecca had arranged for professional-grade disguise elements, gray hair coloring, facial prosthetics that changed my nose and jawline, colored contact lenses, and clothing that completely altered my appearance. Combined with the weight I had lost during my hospital stay, I was unrecognizable even to people who had known me for years. The service was held at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Pasadena, the same church where my parents had been married 4 years earlier. About 200 people attended, including business associates, former employees, neighbors, and family friends who genuinely believed they were mourning my death. Watching people grieve for me while I stood among them was surreal and heartbreaking. My former assistant Sarah was sobbing in the front row. My business partners were visibly shaken, discussing how my death would affect ongoing projects. Several former employees had flown in from other states to pay their respects to a boss they had genuinely respected, but my parents' performance was Oscar-worthy. My mother, dressed in an elegant black dress that she had purchased specifically for the occasion, played the role of grieving mother with devastating effectiveness. She dabbed at her eyes with a laced handkerchief, accepted condolences with stoic grace, and spoke about her son's generosity and success with apparent pride. Marcus was always driven to achieve great things, she told a group of mourners. Even as a child he had such ambition. We always knew he would make something of himself, but we never imagined it would end so soon. My father stood beside her, the picture of a strong man struggling with overwhelming grief. He shook hands with business associates, nodded gravely at expressions of sympathy, and spoke quietly about his son's legacy and the foundation that would continue his work. David's performance was perhaps the most convincing of all. He delivered a eulogy that brought the entire congregation to tears. My brother Marcus wasn't just successful in business, he was successful as a human being. He took care of his family, he gave generously to charity, and he never forgot where he came from. Marcus always said that money was just a tool for helping people, and he lived that philosophy every day of his life. As I listened to David speak about my generosity and family loyalty, I had to resist the urge to stand up and applaud the sheer audacity of his lies. This was the same man who had been recorded 3 days earlier discussing how to dispose of my body once they gained control of my assets. The most chilling moment came during the reception. At my parents' house after the service, I mingled among the mourners, expressing condolences as a family friend who had known Marcus through business connections. This allowed me to hear conversations that revealed how thoroughly my parents had convinced everyone of their grief. But the conversations also revealed something else. Several mourners were discussing my parents' financial situation and expressing concern about how they would manage without their son's support. Eleanor and Robert are going to struggle now, I heard one neighbor say. Marcus was so good to them, always helping with expenses and making sure they were comfortable. I hope he left them well provided for, another mourner added. I'm sure he did. Marcus was always so responsible about family. But still, losing a child and facing financial uncertainty at their age, it's just heartbreaking. My parents overheard these conversations and responded with carefully calculated vulnerability. My mother confided to several guests that while Marcus had been generous during his lifetime, they were still waiting to learn about his final arrangements and were worried about their future security. We don't want to be a burden on anyone, my father said to a group of concerned friends. Marcus always took care of us, but we never wanted to presume about his estate planning. We just hope we'll be able to stay in our home and maintain some dignity in our golden years. These conversations were being recorded by devices I had placed throughout the house, capturing my parents' continued performance of grief while subtly manipulating mourners into supporting their narrative of financial vulnerability. But the most revealing moment came after most guests had left. I was helping clean up in the kitchen when I overheard my parents talking privately in the hallway. I think that went perfectly, my mother said, her voice completely different from the grief tone she had maintained all day. Everyone believes we're devastated and struggling financially. When the insurance money comes through, it will look like a blessing rather than suspicious timing. The eulogy was particularly good, my father replied. David really sold the loving family angle. No one suspects that we had any problems with Marcus. Speaking of the insurance money, my mother continued, David said the investigator wants to meet with us next week. We need to make sure our stories are consistent about Marcus's final days and his state of mind. Don't worry, my father said. We've practiced this enough. Loving son, unexpected medical emergency, tragic loss for the family. The investigator will see exactly what we want her to see. As I listened to my parents planning their continued deception, standing in the same house where mourners had just finished celebrating my life and expressing sympathy for my family's loss, I felt something shift inside me. Whatever familial affection or obligation I had once felt toward these people evaporated completely. They had not only stolen my money and legally murdered me, they had turned my death into a performance, manipulating the genuine grief of people who cared about me to advance their criminal conspiracy. They had defiled the memory of their own son for money. The funeral program I kept as evidence represents more than just their fraud. It represents the moment I realized that Eleanor, Robert, and David Crawford were not my family. They were criminals who happened to share my DNA, and they deserved to be treated as such. My real funeral was over. Now, it was time for their criminal careers to die. ***, the legal documents Patricia Thompson prepared for the coordinated takedown of the criminal network filled 3 briefcases and represented months of meticulous preparation. Federal arrest warrants, RICO indictments, asset seizure orders, and search warrants had been drafted for every member of the conspiracy. The operation would be coordinated simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions to prevent any conspirators from warning others or destroying evidence. Agent Jennifer Walsh of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division had taken personal charge of the investigation after reviewing our evidence. She'd been tracking similar fraud networks for years, but had never had access to the kind of comprehensive documentation we had provided. The recordings, financial records, and surveillance evidence represented the kind of airtight case that federal prosecutors dream about. Mr. Crawford, what your family led us to is bigger than we initially realized, Agent Walsh explained during our final planning meeting. This network has been operating for at least 5 years, and we've identified connections to fraud cases in 7 different states. Your parents' greed has helped us uncover what may be the largest death certificate fraud operation in federal history. The timing of the takedown required precision. We needed to arrest all major players simultaneously to prevent anyone from destroying evidence or fleeing jurisdiction. The operation would begin at exactly 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, when most targets would be at home and unlikely to suspect coordinated law enforcement action. My parents would be arrested at their house in Pasadena. David would be taken into custody at a motel where he'd been staying since my death, apparently to avoid being seen celebrating too obviously in the family home. Ernest Valdez would be arrested at the county registrar's office when he arrived. For work, Detective Morrison would be taken into custody at LAPD headquarters, and Maria Santos would be arrested at her insurance company office. The search warrants were comprehensive. FBI teams would simultaneously search my parents' house, David's motel room, Valdez's office and home, Morrison's residence, and the various shell companies used for money laundering. Every computer, phone, document, and financial record connected to the conspiracy would be seized and analyzed. But the most satisfying aspect of the operation was the element of surprise we had maintained. The network had no idea they were under investigation. The recordings showed they remained confident in their success, continuing to plan additional crimes and discussing how to spend their anticipated windfall 3 days before the operation. I attended a final meeting between my parents and the insurance investigator, using the same disguise techniques that had allowed me to attend my own funeral. I posed as Maria Santos's assistant and was present for the entire conversation. My parents had prepared thoroughly for this meeting. They brought copies of my medical records, the fraudulent death certificate, and detailed financial information about my assets. They had practiced their grief-stricken demeanor and prepared answers to expected questions about my final days. "We appreciate your thoroughness in investigating Marcus's death," my mother told Santos. "We understand that large policies require careful review, and we want to cooperate fully with your process." Santos, unaware that she was being recorded and that federal agents were listening to every word, assured my parents that their claim was progressing normally. "The death certificate appears to be in order, and your son's medical records support the cause of death. I expect we'll be able to process the payout within another week or two." "Is there anything else you need from us?" my father asked. "Any additional documentation or verification?" "Just one final formality," Santos replied. "I'll need written statements from family members, confirming the circumstances of Marcus's death and affirming that there are no disputes about the beneficiary designations." My parents readily agreed, and David was brought in to provide his statement. Watching my brother lie directly to an insurance investigator while federal agents recorded his perjury was both infuriating and satisfying. Every word he spoke was another nail in his legal coffin. "Marcus was the best brother anyone could ask for," David said, looking Santos directly in the eye. "His death was completely unexpected and devastating for our family. The insurance money won't bring him back, but it will help us honor his memory and take care of our parents in their grief." The meeting concluded with Santos assuring my family that the $50 million payout would be processed within days. My parents left the meeting believing they had successfully completed the largest theft of their lives. In reality, they had just provided federal investigators with recorded confessions of insurance fraud, conspiracy, and perjury. The final preparation involved coordinating with media outlets. Agent Walsh wanted maximum coverage of the arrests to encourage other victims of the network to come forward and to deter similar criminal organizations. The story of a tech millionaire whose family tried to murder him for insurance money would generate national attention and send a clear message about the consequences of sophisticated fraud. The night before the operation, I sat in my hotel room, reviewing the evidence that would destroy my family's lives: hundreds of hours of recordings, thousands of documents, financial records showing years of criminal activity, and testimony from cooperating witnesses created an overwhelming case against every member of the conspiracy. But beyond the legal satisfaction, I felt something else: relief. For months, I had been living as a ghost, legally dead while gathering evidence against people who had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. Tomorrow, I would return to the world of the living, and my family would begin their journey into the federal prison system. The trap was set. The evidence was overwhelming, and the arrests were coordinated. My parents had taught me a valuable lesson about family loyalty and trust. Tomorrow, I would return the favor by teaching them about consequences and justice. At exactly 6 a.m., the Crawford family's criminal empire would collapse in a coordinated federal operation, and Marcus Crawford would rise from the dead to watch. It happened. The press release that announced my return from the dead was carefully crafted to maximize both legal impact and media coverage, distributed simultaneously to major news outlets at exactly 6 a.m. It began with a statement that would dominate headlines for weeks. Tech entrepreneur Marcus Crawford, previously reported dead, announces criminal charges against family members who filed fraudulent death certificate during his recovery from heart surgery. I held the press conference in the lobby of the federal courthouse, flanked by FBI agent Walsh and prosecutor Patricia Thompson. The timing was perfect. My parents were being arrested at the exact moment. I was proving to the world that I was very much alive. The gathered reporters were skeptical at first. Several had covered my funeral just weeks earlier, and the idea that I had somehow faked my own death seemed like an elaborate publicity stunt. But when Agent Walsh confirmed the arrests and outlined the charges, the room erupted with questions. "Mr. Crawford, can you explain how you were declared dead while you were obviously still alive?" asked a reporter from the Los Angeles Times. "While I was unconscious during heart surgery, my parents filed a fraudulent death certificate with the help of corrupt county officials," I replied. "They froze my bank accounts, filed insurance claims, and began dividing up my assets while I was in the cardiac CT. I see you recovering from a procedure that actually saved my life." The questions came rapidly after that. How had I discovered the fraud? Why hadn't I revealed myself immediately? What evidence did we have against the conspirators? Patricia Thompson handled the legal questions with prosecutorial precision. The evidence in this case is overwhelming and includes hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, financial records documenting the conspiracy, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. The defendants will face federal charges including mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy under RICO statutes. But the most dramatic moment came when a reporter asked about my emotional response to my family's betrayal. "Mr. Crawford, how do you feel about your own parents trying to profit from your death?" I had prepared for this question, but speaking the words aloud was more difficult than I had expected. "I've learned that DNA doesn't create family character, does? The people who raised me chose money over their son's life. That's not a family relationship worth preserving." The press conference was being broadcast live on multiple networks, which meant my parents were watching their world collapse in real time. At the exact moment I was revealing their crimes to the nation, FBI agents were handcuffing them in their living room. Agent Walsh had arranged for me to watch the arrests through live surveillance feeds. The footage of my parents being taken into custody was both satisfying and heartbreaking. These were people I had once loved, people who had raised me and shaped my early life. Being arrested for attempting to destroy everything I had built, my mother's reaction was pure shock. When FBI agents knocked on her door at 6 a.m., she opened it expecting to find delivery, personnel, or neighbors. Instead, she found federal agents with arrest warrants. The recording captured her exact words. "There must be some mistake. Our son is dead, we're grieving. This is harassment." When the agents explained that Marcus Crawford was very much alive and had been cooperating with their investigation, my mother's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the couch, staring at the agents in complete disbelief. "That's impossible," she kept repeating. "We saw the death certificate. We went to his funeral." My father's arrest was more dramatic. When agents informed him of the charges against him, he became aggressive and defiant. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "Marcus died during surgery. I have the death certificate right here." He actually produced a copy of the fraudulent document as evidence of my death, essentially handing the FBI proof of his own crime. David's arrest at the motel was captured on body camera footage that would later become evidence at trial. When agents knocked on his door, he tried to flee through the bathroom window. He made it about 10 feet before being tackled by agents positioned outside. His first words after being handcuffed were, "How did you find out? Marcus is dead." The simultaneous arrests across the network created a media spectacle that dominated news coverage for days. Television reporters stood outside the county registrar's office as Ernest Valdez was perp-walked to a federal vehicle. Detective Morrison's arrest at LAPD headquarters was particularly dramatic, with footage of a police officer being arrested by federal agents for corruption. But the story that captured public attention was the family betrayal angle, the idea that parents would try to profit from their son's death while he was unconscious in a hospital. Bed struck a nerve with audiences across the country. Social media exploded with commentary about family greed, inheritance disputes, and the corruption of family relationships by money. Within hours of the press conference, I was receiving interview requests from every major news program in the country. 60 Minutes wanted an exclusive investigation. Netflix was interested in documentary rights. Publishers were calling about book deals. The public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. Messages poured in from people who had experienced similar family betrayals, financial fraud victims, and business leaders who respected my decision to fight back against the conspiracy. The hashtag back from the dead trended on social media for 3 days. But beyond the media circus, the arrests had accomplished something more important. They had dismantled a criminal network that had been operating for years. The evidence we had provided led to additional arrests, as other victims came forward and law enforcement identified previously unknown crimes. The insurance company immediately reversed the death benefit claim and restored my account access. Banks began unfreezing assets as the fraudulent death certificate was officially voided. Government agencies updated their records to reflect that Marcus Crawford was alive and had been the victim of an elaborate fraud scheme. 3 months after my parents had tried to kill me legally, I was fully restored to life. My bank accounts were accessible, my business operations resumed, and my legal status was corrected. But more importantly, the people who had betrayed me were facing the consequences of their actions. The press release had been more than just an announcement, it was a declaration of war. My family had thought they could eliminate me with paperwork and corruption. Instead, they had eliminated themselves from my life forever, while facing decades in federal prison. Marcus Crawford had returned from the dead, and his resurrection had brought justice with it. ***, the court transcripts from United States v. Crawford, ETL. Read like a masterclass in how not to commit federal crimes. Over 6 weeks of testimony, the prosecution presented evidence so overwhelming that even the defense attorneys seemed embarrassed by their clients' actions. The trial was held in the Central District Court of California, with Judge Margaret Chen presiding. Judge Chen was known for her no-nonsense approach to white-collar crime, and she made it clear from the beginning that she would not tolerate any attempts to minimize the seriousness of the charges my parents had hired. separate attorneys using money from a legal defense fund that David had somehow managed to establish before his arrest. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that they were using crowd-funded donations to defend themselves against charges of stealing from their own son. Eleanor, Crawford's attorney, James Morrison, attempted a strategy that backfired spectacularly. During opening statements, he portrayed my mother as a confused elderly woman who had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals. Mrs. Crawford is a simple woman who was grieving the loss of her son and was taken advantage of by people who exploited her emotional vulnerability. The prosecution destroyed this narrative within hours. They played recordings of my mother discussing the insurance money with obvious glee, coordinating meetings with corrupt officials, and celebrating the success of their scheme. The jury heard her laughing about my supposed death and planning how to spend the stolen money. When my mother took the stand in her own defense, her performance was devastating to her case. Under cross-examination, she attempted to maintain the grieving mother persona while simultaneously trying to justify her actions. I was told my son was dead. She testified I was in shock, and when people started talking about paperwork and insurance, I just went along with it. I didn't understand what was happening. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez, calmly played a recording of my mother's voice from 3 days after my surgery. "Robert, this worked out perfectly. Marcus is gone. We have the death certificate, and the insurance money is practically guaranteed. I almost feel guilty about how easy this was." The jury's reaction to hearing my mother's actual words was visible shock and disgust. Several jurors shook their heads in disbelief. One elderly woman in the jury box was crying. "Mrs. Crawford," Prosecutor Martinez continued, "does that sound like someone who was confused about what was happening?" My mother's response was a rambling explanation about how the stress of the situation had made her say things she didn't mean. It was the kind of performance that convinces juries of guilt rather than innocence. Robert Crawford's defense was equally unsuccessful. His attorney attempted to portray him as a man who had been pressured into the scheme by his wife and younger son, but the recordings revealed him to be an active participant who had actually suggested some of the more sophisticated aspects of the fraud. When my father testified, his arrogance destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for him. He actually blamed me for creating the situation that led to their crimes. "Marcus had more money than he could ever spend," my father said during his testimony. "He was always showing off his wealth, making us feel like failures. When the opportunity came to finally get what we deserved after raising him and supporting his dreams, we took it." The prosecutor asked the obvious follow-up question, "Mr. Crawford, are you saying that your son deserved to have his death faked and his money stolen because he was successful?" "I'm saying that family should take care of family," my father replied. Marcus forgot where he came from. The jury's faces showed exactly what they thought of that explanation, but the most dramatic testimony came from David, who had agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence. His plea bargain required him to testify truthfully about the entire conspiracy, including details that implicated our parents even more deeply. David's testimony revealed the extent of their premeditation. He described conversations that had taken place months before my surgery, where our parents had discussed ways to access my money if something happened to me. He testified that they had researched death certificate procedures long before my medical emergency. They weren't reacting to an opportunity, David testified. They were implementing a plan they'd been developing for months. When Marcus had the heart attack, they saw it as their chance to put that plan into action. Under cross-examination, David broke down completely. When my mother's attorney asked why he had betrayed his own parents by cooperating with prosecutors, David's response was raw and honest because they betrayed their own son first. Marcus almost died on that operating table, and while he was fighting for his life, our parents were trying to profit from his death. I helped them do it, and I'll live with that guilt forever. But I won't lie in court to protect people who would steal from their own child. The conspiracy evidence was equally damning. Prosecutor Martinez presented phone records showing coordination between my parents and corrupt officials, financial records documenting payments for fraudulent services, and surveillance footage of meetings between conspirators. Ernest Valdez had already pleaded guilty and was cooperating with the prosecution. His testimony about the mechanics of creating false death certificates was clinical and detailed. He explained exactly how my parents had approached him, what they had paid him, and how they had coordinated to file the fraudulent paperwork. Detective Morrison's testimony was perhaps the most shocking. Facing federal corruption charges, he had also agreed to cooperate. He described a criminal network that had been operating for years, with dozens of victims and millions of dollars in stolen assets. When the prosecution rested its case, the evidence against my parents was overwhelming. Hours of recorded conversations, financial records documenting their crimes, testimony from cooperating conspirators, and their own admissions during police interviews created an airtight case. The defense attorneys made brief closing arguments that essentially asked for mercy rather than acquittal. They couldn't dispute the evidence, so they asked the jury to consider the defendants' ages and the stress they had been under. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. When Judge Chen read the verdicts, my mother collapsed in her chair. My father sat stone-faced, apparently still unable to believe that their plan had failed so completely. At sentencing 2 months later, Judge Chen was unsparing in her comments. The defendants attempted to profit from what they believed was their son's death. When that death proved to be fabricated, they continued their scheme anyway. This represents a level of greed and callousness that demands significant punishment. Eleanor Crawford received 12 years in federal prison. Robert Crawford received 15 years. The sentences reflected their ages at 68 and 71. They would likely spend the remainder of their lives incarcerated. David, who had cooperated with the prosecution, received 6 years. His attorney argued that his cooperation and genuine remorse warranted leniency. But Judge Chen noted that he had been an active participant in trying to defraud his own brother. As I watched my parents being led away in shackles, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. These were people who had raised me, who had once loved me in their own flawed way, and who had destroyed their lives through their own greed and moral bankruptcy. But the pity was mixed with satisfaction. Justice had been served. The criminal network had been dismantled, and other potential victims had been protected. My family's betrayal had led to consequences that extended far beyond their own punishment. The court transcripts would become part of the public record, a permanent documentation of how greed can corrupt family relationships and lead to devastating consequences. For me, they represented the final chapter of my relationship with the people who had given me life and then tried to steal it back. The new will I drafted 6 months after the trial was the most difficult document I had ever signed. Unlike my previous estate planning, which had included generous provisions for my parents and brother, this version completely excluded my biological family from any inheritance. The Marcus Crawford Foundation would receive everything, every dollar, every asset, every share of stock I had accumulated over decades of work. The decision to disinherit my family wasn't made in anger, though anger had certainly played a role in the immediate aftermath of their betrayal. Instead, it was made after months of reflection about what family truly means and who deserves to benefit from a lifetime of labor and sacrifice. My previous will had allocated 30% of my estate to my parents and 20% to David, reflecting a sense of family obligation that I now recognized as fundamentally misguided. I had assumed that blood relationships created inherent duties and entitlements, that success carried an obligation to share with relatives regardless of their character or behavior. The betrayal had taught me that family is something earned through loyalty, love, and mutual respect, not something automatically granted through genetic connection. My parents and brother had forfeited any claim to family status when they chose greed over basic human decency, but writing them out of my will was about more than punishment. It was about ensuring that my life's work would benefit people who deserved it rather than people who had tried to steal it. The foundation I established would provide technology, education to underprivileged children, kids who reminded me of myself at 7 years old, living in a trailer park but dreaming of something better. The emotional toll of the entire experience was something I hadn't anticipated. Even though I had been vindicated and my family had been punished, the process of discovering their betrayal and fighting back had fundamentally changed me. I found myself questioning relationships that had once seemed secure, analyzing conversations for hidden motives, and struggling to trust people who had given me no reason for suspicion. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the therapist I began seeing after the trial, helped me understand that betrayal trauma creates lasting changes in how we perceive relationships and assess trustworthiness. Marcus, what you experienced wasn't just financial fraud, she explained during one of our sessions. It was a fundamental violation of the most basic human relationship, the bond between parent and child. That kind of betrayal affects how you see the world. The therapy sessions were initially difficult because they forced me to confront feelings I had been avoiding while focused on gathering evidence and pursuing justice. Beneath the anger and determination was profound grief, not just for the parents I had lost, but for the illusion of family I had carried my entire life. I grieved for the childhood memories that were now tainted by the knowledge of my parents' true character. I mourned the family holidays that I now realized had been performances, the expressions of pride that had been calculations, the moments of apparent love that had been manipulations designed to maintain access to my financial resources. But the therapy also helped me recognize something positive in the experience. It had freed me from obligations that had been based on guilt rather than genuine affection. For years, I had supported my family not because I enjoyed their company or valued their relationship, but because I felt responsible for their well-being, simply because we shared DNA. The new will represented more than legal documentation. It was a declaration of independence from toxic family dynamics that had shaped my life for decades. By leaving everything to the foundation, I was ensuring that my death, whenever it eventually occurred naturally, would create genuine benefit rather than enabling destructive behavior. The foundation itself became a source of unexpected fulfillment. Working with children who were eager to learn programming and technology reminded me why I had started building companies in the first place. It wasn't about accumulating wealth, it was about creating something meaningful and helping others achieve their potential. Sarah Chen, whom I hired as the foundation's executive director, brought the same energy and intelligence to educational philanthropy that she had once brought to managing my business affairs. Under her leadership, the foundation expanded rapidly, opening computer labs in underserved schools and providing scholarships for promising students who couldn't afford technology education. Marcus, these kids remind me of you, Sarah told me. During a visit to one of our computer labs, they have that same hunger to learn, that same determination to build something better. Your family's betrayal led to something beautiful. She was right. My parents' attempt to steal my legacy had actually resulted in a legacy that was more meaningful than anything I had previously planned. Instead of enabling their destructive behavior with inherited wealth, my resources would help deserving children escape poverty through education and opportunity. The media attention from the trial had also created unexpected opportunities. Publishers wanted to tell my story. Speaking agencies sought me for presentations about family dynamics and financial security, and other fraud victims reached out for advice and support. But I was selective about these opportunities, accepting only those that served educational purposes or helped other people avoid similar betrayals. I had no interest in becoming a celebrity based on my family's crimes, but I was willing to share my experience if it could protect others from similar devastation. The most meaningful connection came from other people who had experienced family betrayal. Their letters and emails revealed that my story wasn't unique, that families across the country were dealing with similar issues of financial manipulation, inheritance disputes, and relatives who viewed successful family members as personal ATMs rather than people deserving respect and love. A year after the trial, I could honestly say that I was happier and more at peace than I had been in decades. The weight of family obligation that had burdened me for years was gone. The relationships in my life were now based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than genetic accident and financial dependency. My new will wasn't just a legal document. It was a manifesto about chosen family, earned loyalty, and the difference between relatives and family. The people who would inherit from me now were the children who would benefit from educational programs, the communities that would be strengthened by opportunity, and the future generations who would build upon the foundation I had established. My parents had tried to steal my death. Instead, they had given me a chance to create a more meaningful life. *** The Foundation Charter. I signed 2 years after my resurrection, established the Marcus Crawford Foundation for Family Fraud Victims as a permanent institution dedicated to helping people who had experienced financial betrayal by relatives. The organization would provide legal assistance, counseling services, and financial support to victims while advocating for stronger protections against family-based financial crimes. Creating the foundation wasn't just about was about transforming my painful experience into something that could help others avoid or recover from similar devastation. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed my life would become the foundation for protecting other families from the same kind of predatory behavior. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the private investigator who had helped expose my family's conspiracy, became the foundation's director of victim services. Her law enforcement background and understanding of financial fraud made her uniquely qualified to help other victims navigate the complex process of investigating and prosecuting family members who had betrayed their trust. Marcus, what we learned from your case is that family fraud is far more common than most people realize, Rebecca explained during our first board meeting. Families often don't report these crimes because of shame, guilt, or misplaced loyalty. We need to create a safe space where victims can get help without judgment. The foundation's first major case involved an elderly woman whose daughter had been stealing her Social Security benefits and emptying her savings accounts. Like many family fraud victims, she had been reluctant to report the theft because she didn't want to see her daughter arrested. Our intervention helped recover most of her stolen money while connecting her with support services that allowed her to live independently. Within 6 months, we were handling dozens of similar cases across California. Adult children stealing from elderly parents, siblings manipulating inheritance documents, spouses hiding assets during divorce proceedings. The variety of family-based financial crimes was staggering and heartbreaking, but the foundation also provided something more personal for me, a sense of purpose that went beyond business success. Each victim we helped represented a small victory against the kind of greed and betrayal that had infected my own family. Every dollar we recovered for fraud victims felt like justice being served on a broader scale. The foundation's educational programs became equally important. We developed workshops for financial institutions to help them identify potential family fraud, created legal guides for victims who wanted to understand their options, and partnered with law enforcement agencies to improve investigation and prosecution of these crimes. Sarah Chen, who had become both the foundation's executive director and one of my closest friends, helped me understand how the experience had changed my perspective on relationships and success. Marcus, before your family's betrayal, you measured success primarily in financial terms, she observed. Now you measure it in terms of impact and authentic relationships. That's a profound transformation. She was right. The man who had been declared dead during heart surgery was fundamentally different from the man who had awakened to discover his family's betrayal. My priorities had shifted from accumulating wealth to creating meaning, from maintaining family obligations to building genuine relationships, from individual success to community impact. The transformation extended to my personal life as well. I began dating Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the therapist who had helped me process the trauma of family betrayal. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, built on honest communication and mutual respect rather than the financial calculations that had defined my family relationships. I never thought I'd be grateful for my parents' betrayal, I told Elizabeth during one of our conversations, but it freed me from relationships that were based on obligation rather than affection. It taught me the difference between relatives and family. Elizabeth helped me understand that healthy relationships require boundaries, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being, qualities that had been completely absent from my interactions with my biological family. With her, I experienced what it meant to be valued for who I was rather than what I could provide financially. The business empire I had built continued to grow, but it no longer defined my identity or consumed my energy. Crawford Technologies remained successful, but I delegated more responsibility to capable executives while focusing on the foundation's work and my personal relationships. 3 years after the trial, I received a letter from David in federal prison. He had served half his sentence and was seeking reconciliation, asking if I would visit him or respond to his correspondence. The letter was filled with apologies and expressions of remorse, along with explanations about gambling addiction and family pressure. I showed the letter to Elizabeth and asked for her perspective. Marcus, forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the person who hurt you, she said, but forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. You can let go of anger without rebuilding relationships that were fundamentally toxic. I chose not to respond to David's letter. Forgiveness was a process I was working through in therapy, but I had no interest in rebuilding relationships with people who had demonstrated such profound moral bankruptcy. Some betrayals are too fundamental to overcome, and some relationships are too damaged to repair. The foundation charter that established our permanent mission included a personal statement that reflected my transformation. The Marcus Crawford Foundation was born from betrayal, but dedicated to healing. We believe that families should be sources of support and love, not exploitation and harm. When family relationships become predatory, society has an obligation to protect victims and hold perpetrators accountable. 5 years after my parents filed my fraudulent death certificate, I could honestly say that their betrayal had led to the most meaningful period of my life. The foundation had helped hundreds of victims, prevented countless financial crimes, and created a model for addressing family fraud that was being replicated across the country. My relationship with Elizabeth had evolved into a partnership based on shared values and mutual support. My friendships were deeper and more authentic than they had ever been when I was burdened by toxic family obligations. My business continued to thrive, but it was now one part of a balanced life, rather than the sole source of my identity. The fraudulent death certificate that my parents had filed to steal my money had in a way been accurate. The Marcus Crawford, who had built wealth for its own sake, who had maintained family relationships based on guilt and obligation, who had measured success primarily in financial terms, that person had died during the betrayal. The man who had emerged from that experience was someone I respected more, a person who understood the difference between relatives and family, who built relationships based on character rather than genetics, who used wealth as a tool for creating positive impact rather than accumulating power. My parents had tried to kill me for money. Instead, they had killed the parts of me that weren't worth preserving and given birth to a person I was proud to become. Their betrayal had been intended to end my story, but it had actually begun the best chapter of my life. Standing in the Foundation's newest computer lab, watching children from underprivileged backgrounds learn programming skills that could transform their futures, I realized that my resurrection had been complete. I had returned from the dead, not just legally, but emotionally and spiritually. The Marcus Crawford Foundation for Family Fraud Victims would outlive me by decades, protecting future generations from the kind of betrayal I had experienced. My real legacy wouldn't be the wealth I had accumulated, but the healing I had helped create and the justice I had helped deliver. Some people rise from the dead seeking revenge. I had risen seeking justice and found something even more valuable: redemption, purpose, and authentic relationships that no amount of money could buy. My family had declared me dead to steal my life. Instead, they had given me the chance to truly live.